26. Pigs, the terrifying swine of the 17th century. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, it's all about pigs. The images we carry around in our heads of Babe and Wilbur from Charlotte's Web are way off the mark when it comes to the colonial pigs. They were leaner, meaner, and also more likely to spend their first cold winter sharing the house with you. Unhousebroken piglets aside, they were intensely useful animals for all the colonists from Maine to South Carolina and everywhere in between. I will run down how they were used and some of the trouble they caused. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. There are no pigs native to North or South America. But there are 3 different species of peccaries, a distant cousin of the pig, that cannot interbreed with it. The most northerly type of peccary are generally known as javelinas and are found from Texas all the way to Argentina, with the other 2 having ranges entirely within Central and South America. So every last Caribbean and North American pig encountered by the British colonists was either their own import or an escaped pig brought mostly by the Spaniards during the 16th century as they were causing havoc and blundering around Florida, Mexico, and the islands. The pigs all Europeans knew were descendants of the Eurasian boar Sus scrofa. Just as with oxen or cows and their single bovine ancestor, there was also a single swine ancestor. Pig domestication seems to have taken place at about the same time as cow domestication, around 10,000 years ago. But domestic piggy herds seem to have been less of a topic for artists than oxen, so other than the either heroic or tragic boar hunt, there is markedly less swine art. And as with the bovids, different domesticated pigs, Sus scrofa domestica, were developed everywhere, with the traits that suited them for their local conditions. Unlike domesticated bovids, which appear to take multiple generations to revert to something threatening-looking, pigs seem to take around 2 generations to start to show their wild boar roots. Tusks reappear in the males, their legs lengthen, and the crests of hair spring up on their spines. This makes it clear that what makes a good farmyard pig is a farmer's idea, and what makes a good wild boar is the pig's idea. Both the piggy and the boar live somewhere in all swine. But the early swine that came to North America, whether with the Spanish, the Dutch, or the British, all of them were not penned, or barely penned most of the time. While cows give birth to 1 or at most 2 calves at a time, and they increase pretty rapidly during the 17th century. Pigs, on the other hand, have litters of 4 to a dozen little piglets. Their population nearly exploded. Cows are also easier to control based on their particular vegan requirements, and are usually at low energy about a third of the year due to the seasons of grass. Pigs are less willing to be limited. They are omnivores, and they industriously use their strong, flexible, yet sensitive snouts to dig up the landscape in search of fruits, nuts, roots, insects, grubs, worms, and a variety of other foodstuffs any civilized 17th century English person would have blanched at, including carrion. While a cow or 2 might be usually shooed or shoved out of the way, after all, they are relatively stolid and placid despite being pretty huge. Pigs, on the other hand, could quickly gain German fairy tale monster status. Roger Williams of colonial Rhode Island fame made note of, quote, 2 English swine, unquote, that had run a wolf off a deer it had killed. And if you're still wondering about that omnivore status, take a look at a pig's set of teeth. Tusks aside, they have a similar arrangement to primate teeth, with incisors in front for biting off chunks, along with premolars and then molars for various chewing tasks. This also meant they were dedicated destroyers in any garden patch, eating the greens on top as well as the roots below, whether it was planted by colonists or a local tribe. The English colonists were used to building fences, and readily did. The Native Americans, not so much. But they were happy to turn garden-invading pigs into dinner and consider the damage to the crops canceled out by the miscreant becoming food. Unsurprisingly, many a pig owner, and ownership was usually indicated by a pattern of ear notches and occasionally ear or nose rings for special hogs, the pig owners didn't see a pig traded for a dug-up garden as fair at all. The garden keeper should be fencing things in. The wandering pig wasn't the problem. Rather, the savage, unfenced gardening practices were. While much of the modern 20th and 21st century pig imagery has been around these friendly-looking, well-scrubbed baby pigs, Wilbur and Babe with their low-slung bodies, adorable curly tails, and guileless eyes, or the impressively rotund, waddling country fair hogs that are set to provide impressive rib racks, hams, and flitches of bacon. The 17th century pig was a trimmer, fleeter beast. It had longer legs, was not able to acquire such an incredible store of lard. The American pig as lard hog will be more of a 19th century development, and was expected to fend for itself in the forest when threatened by the wolves, wildcats, and weasels of the American wilderness, and commonly had a bit of tusk showing. These semi-wild pigs would roam the woods and waterways, and later, as towns developed, the streets as well. They were somewhat handy because they ate up the food scraps and much of the organic litter of the 17th century town life, and were good at feeding themselves out of kitchen middens or garbage piles. Unfortunately, they would leave behind their own waste in the process of working as street cleaners. While most households would call their pigs back in to a lean-to or small shack for the night, often with the scraps from the day's cookery or a few corn cobs, not all pigs were into the return home at night life. More and more unclaimed pigs roamed the growing towns. Wandering unclaimed swine were enough of a problem that the Massachusetts Bay Colony had a hog reeve or pig catcher by 1636, and Newport, Rhode Island had a hog pound for straying swine by the 1660s. The semi-wild pig was also a big part of pork culture in Virginia and the Carolinas. But as pigs dug up the precious tobacco and started inflicting too much damage on the fruit trees that became essential for the alcohol brewing trade around the Chesapeake, the forest hog was curbed. There are several complaints and diaries about how the penned pig had lost its savor, and that the acorn-feeding forest pig was of superior quality. The fact that the 17th century colonial pig was semi-wild is reflected in the fact that the preferred method of dispatch for full-sized hogs was shooting them. This was a combination of obviously not being able to generally get cozy with most pigs, see above notes on pigs being fast and bitey. But again, don't forget that most of the English colonists were not farm people. And it was easier to learn how to shoot a pig than to skillfully, cleanly, and humanely cut its throat, as the skilled farmers of Europe usually did. Within the German and Dutch enclaves, there was usually plenty of pig butchering knowledge. But again, those two groups had brought successful farmers as part of their starter sets. This meant that the cooking and preservation techniques among different groups differed wildly. While the English colonists were more likely to resort to simple salting and brining and a little smoking, the German colonists, along with the Dutch, had a much wider array of ways to butcher, divide, preserve, and eventually serve up their pork. It's a cliché that every part of the pig is used but the squeal, but in the 17th century, it was extremely true. This is the one area where all the colonists were closer in skill levels when it came to dealing with piglets and making useful objects out of the pig products. Women of nearly all social stations were expected to have facility in the kitchen, whether they were a farm woman or not. And the fashioning of things like brushes and leather goods was actually the province of the town artisan. Piglets were classified with fowl and fish in terms of labor. They were small enough to be dispatched by housewives, along with the associated dressing and cooking. So piglet cookery fell in with brewing, bread making, pickling, and fish and fowl roasting. So just how did a 17th century pig, once it was caught and turned into food, end up on the dinner table. Was it any good? And just what were the ways, other than salting the absolute living heck out of it, that pork was preserved? Because pork took well to pickling, salting, and or brining, along with smoking and then aging for a few years, it was appreciated as a food that could actually be kept the year round, or even longer to hedge against a bad year. But pork was also enjoyed fresh, though for a short time after butchering. No fridges, and in the 17th century, mostly no cellars, spring houses, or storage wells meant that preserved products was how most pork was consumed. When pork was eaten fresh, it was treated like all other meats and had the absolute dickens cooked out of it. Pig, as with the roaming cattle and wild deer, were all well exercised and in no way supposed to be parasite or disease-free. So boiling or simmering pork for quite a while and then roasting it over a fire or cutting up the par-cooked pork and adding it to a stew or succotash was a very common way to complete the cooking. As with other livestock, the pig innards or plucks were considered treats of the harvest to be enjoyed right away. And again, things like the liver and brain were very fatty, so did not preserve well. But they were also a few of the tender bits that required little preparation to make edible in these well-exercised hogs. The larger cuts of meat that weren't to be eaten fresh went one of two routes: short preservation or collaring, and long preservation or sousing. Collared and soused are the techniques that show up for all sorts of meat: beef, venison, fish, eels, and so on. To quote, collar pork, unquote, a few different techniques were used to do the preserving, but preparing any of these items was fairly similar. A large, fairly thin sheet of meat was created. This might be a split open fish or a piece of pork butterflied or cut open like a book. Some sort of filling, often made of egg yolks, lard, farce, or force meats, and an array of whatever spices were to hand. Salt, pepper, cloves, mace, and bay were commonly called for, though they were likely rarely at hand for much of the 17th century. The flat piece of meat would be rolled tightly and then cooked in one of a few different ways. Sometimes the meat roll would be placed in a boiling salty vinegar solution, simmered and allowed to cool in the vinegar solution and stored that way. Slices of the collar would be cut and served as needed for a few weeks. The storage solution could be reboiled and skimmed to freshen it if it needed it. Another way to cook and store the collar, and this would have happened only as grains and ovens both appeared in the latter part of the century, collared meats could be placed in a pie basin. Gravies or a strong broth with large amounts of collagen or jellying agents would be poured over the collar. Then this would be covered with a wheat or rye paste, a dough lid. The resulting pie would often be cooked with the rest of the baking. When the pie cooled, the wheat or rye lid would protect the jellied broth or gravy inside, which in turn would keep air away from the collared meat. This sort of air exclusion would work for a week or two in cool weather, but wasn't particularly useful or long-lasting in warmer weather. And what the English colonists quickly discovered is that while the winters of New England were shockingly colder than the Old English ones, the summers were another conundrum altogether. Now, you wouldn't know it from watching the most recent seasons of the Great British Bake Off or Baking Show or whatever, but weeks of 32°C or 90 Fahrenheit weather is not normal in England. So the Boston summer heat caught everyone off guard, not to mention the leather, wool, and metal armor-clad adventurers sweating away in the Chesapeake. And then even further south, in the tobacco-crazy Carolinas, there was almost no time of year that just preserving things under a pie crust would do at all. Hot and humid weather called for the souse or the strong pickle. Since all the salt available in the 17th century colonies was some form of sea salt produced by a combination of solar and wood fire heating, it came in varying qualities. A pickling barrel might be lined and topped with common or lesser quality salt, but the salt among the pieces of pork would be the better bay salt. When the pickling solution or souse was made, a cauldron was filled with several gallons of water, and about a pint of salt per 2 gallons of water was added. Once that dissolved, a bit more salt would go in until the salt stopped dissolving. This mixture would be boiled and impurities would be skimmed off as they rose to the surface. To give the salting process some extra heft, saltpeter or potassium nitrate would be added to the strewing or powdering salt. If you remember from the salt episode, nitrates are extra hard on creepy crawlies, both the visible and the microscopic kind. Nitrates can be harmful to humans, but only in large quantities, though there is modern evidence that finds long-term exposure to nitrates can be detrimental. But every single colonist was happily trading some distant possible long-term harm for the immediate protections it provided from both food poisoning and starvation. Corned pork was cooked in the brine and left to hang out there. Pickled pork would be layered raw with the common salt and the salt/saltpeter mixture. Once a pickling barrel was full, or all the desired pork was layered in, the cooled brine would be poured over. A flat rock or pottery disc would be placed atop both sorts of pork, and it would be weighted down. As long as the brine was kept over the pork, it would keep for months, if not years. And the salt pork could be revitalized with a swim in simmering water to draw out some of the salt before it was made into other dishes. While the very fatty lard hogs of the future were not yet present, larger 17th century hogs did have some deposits of fat, along with the hard, clean suet around the kidneys. The fat would often be pickled separately to be used for seasoning in pies, stews, force meats, and with beans, including the now famous Boston baked beans. The suet and the lard would also be tried out or melted so all the water, protein, and other bits that were not fat could be removed. The purified fat, bereft of its liquid, was pretty safe from spoilage. Suet, tried out on its own, would become tallow, which was favored as a lid for potted meats or could be made into soap or candles, though beef tallow was always preferred over pork for candles as it was harder and smoked less when burned. Once the organs and large salted cuts of meat were dealt with, it was time to get to the sausages, pickling end bits, and the hams. Sausages are now ground and spiced, but in the 17th century, they were simply finely sliced trimmings off of bones and some fat bits. Spices were initially hard to come by, though again, the later German colonists brought their garden spices like cumin, caraway, and dill. Incidentally, most of the things we think of as sausage spices were not present. There were no chili peppers. Black pepper would have only shown up in the very richest households, and even then, possibly not in something as mundane as sausage. Thyme and mustard would have been used since they were easy to come by, and even grew wild. Garlic was rarely used, especially by the English, who typically viewed garlic with some suspicion. Onions would have been too watery, and there was definitely no onion powder. However, sausage was usually served in gravy, and that was often spiced to make up for the plainness of the sausages. But again, the desired spices in the gravy were often nutmeg, cloves, and mace, along with pepper and bay. Desired, I say, but rarely to be found. To store the sausages, they were almost always stuffed inside the well-cleaned pig intestines. Along with the meat scrap sausages, black puddings, or pig's blood mixed with salt and cornmeal, were also boiled and dried or smoked to be saved for later. If not all the intestines were used for sausage casing, they could be eaten as their own side dish or included in stews. These cleaned but unfilled intestines are what is currently known as chitterlings or chitlins. While pig and cow butchering time happened as the cold weather set in, not everywhere had cooperatively cold enough weather. Sure, Maine and the Massachusetts Bay colonies could depend on snow, but Virginia, and then further south into the Carolinas, even December and January could not be depended on to be properly frosty. Another way to fend off the insect and microscopic food competitors had to be found when just salting and drying weren't always doing the trick. Because let's face it, there are just a lot of flying, biting, pesky bugs the further south you go. Well, smoke was the answer. Not only does it fend off the biting flies, gnats, and mosquitoes, it protects from the rot as well. Early on, sausages and some of the soused pork would be placed in the house fireplaces to smoke. But these colonists had space and wood to spare. Between the fact that always leaving a fire going is dangerous, and the best fires for smoking meat are smoky, the separate smokehouse of the southern colonies was born. Built away from the house, these shacks would contain a low, smoky fire for weeks at a time. Different kinds of wood became favorites, with hickory and fruit woods rising to the top, though corn cobs were almost always in the mix because they were just around. Clear definitions of what was ham and what was bacon at this point was often an arbitrary designation. Bacon could be any salted smoke cut of meat. The fatty bacon we think of today from the belly or pork jowl was often simply differentiated as fatty bacon. The baconing, as with pickling last week, was more often about the process rather than the particular cut. Just as pork butt is actually now a pork shoulder. At the time that name originated, it had to do with pork that was barrel kept, and a favorite type for the job was the butt size of barrel, which incidentally is about 126 gallons or 477 liters, which means buttload really did start as a technical term. And for what it's worth, a hogshead barrel was about 63 gallons or 238 liters. Don't worry about these exact amounts because, again, all these barrels were handmade and the volumes were averages. But it's good to know for trivia night which one was bigger. Anyway, once your ham or blood sausage or bacon was well and truly smoked and had a nice, sturdy, dry rind on the outside, it could start aging. Last week's pickles and also beer, dairy, and bread weeks were all about fermentation, where sugars were eaten and turned into alcohol, carbon dioxide, or acid. The salted smoked meat, on the other hand, are basically all protein, sprinkled with some fat. Fermentation is not what happens here. Instead, different protein-munching bacteria, working much more slowly in these salty, low-water environments, work to alter proteins. They denature or untangle them a bit. It is true this is a form of rot, but a slow, controlled, and again, largely beneficial, if for nothing else, for taste. This is where nutty, sweet, and floral flavors can enter into salted and then smoked and aged meats. Dry Virginia hams and prosciutto share many characteristics, including a coating of some particular molds on the outside rind, as the meat inside is altered by slow bacterial action. These dry hams took more time to make, but they were much appreciated because they were fully cooked, ready to eat, and kept for a long time, even in their partially consumed state. Wet hams that were only brined or lightly smoked still needed to be boiled, and once cooked were subject to similar spoilage problems as any other meat. Pig heads, as with cow heads, were quite full of lots of but scrappy meat. This was often chopped with the tongue and maw, or the muscular part of the stomach, to make head cheese. Cheese at this point in history still meant a substance that could be molded and cut into solid slices when cold. So dairy cheese and head cheese were both equally valid terms. Incidentally, the chess pie was initially cheese pie. Not that it contained dairy, it doesn't, but that it was chilled and sliced like all the other cheeses, rather than served hot and scooped out of the crust like a crumbly mincemeat pie or a gravy-dripping pigeon pie. Head cheese was usually all the bits of meat from the head, held together by gelatin made by boiling the head with its collagen-y parts, along with many of the pig bones and tendons and such. Because hog maw is the pig's stomach, It could also get the pudding treatment, stuffed with chopped meat and maybe some vegetables and organ bits along with a filler starch. This was common in the German communities, though instead of the oatmeal of Scottish haggis, cornmeal was the common colonial starch. In the 18th century, potatoes would make their mark. But in the 17th century, even at the end, it was not potato time yet. A similar mixture could be made and cooked without the maw. And this scraps and cornmeal pudding is what we still have as scrapple. The last edible parts of the pig were the ears, tail, neck, feet, and hocks. The ears would be used for their collagen and sometimes chopped and fried with the other little tidbits. Crispy fried pig ear salad had a moment in the American restaurant scene sunshine in the 2010s, but braised pig ears are a regular part of cuisines with a different texture vocabulary than the Anglo-American one. But they've fallen off the general American table. Tails and necks were, and still are, valued for the savory and collagen power they give to pork stocks. The average American doesn't make 10 gallons of broth at a go. But if you're feeling adventurous, groceries that serve mainly Black, Vietnamese, Chinese, Italian, Portuguese, and South and Central American neighborhoods will often have these items so you can make a rich pork stock of your own. The hocks and feet, hock is basically the ankle and meatier than the foot, were also kept for their meat and savoriness. Hocks might be salted and smoked as sort of mini hams or bacons, or both were also long boiled until they literally fell apart, and the bits of slippery, gelatin-rich meat could be extracted. Because these areas were very hard-working parts of the animal, they were low in fat, which meant they kept well in a pickle brine. And because the pickled pig's feet and ham hocks keep so well, are easy to season and spice, are tasty, and are of a pretty convenient size, they, along with hams, are one of the few carryovers of the 17th century colonial pig butchery that can still be found in grocery stores today. So if you've learned nothing else today, I hope you'll come away with these two main points. First, don't pet pigs unless someone particularly explains that one is a pet. And even then, be wary. They would eat you if you were carrion. And second, if you eat pork, and all you have eaten is the modern, regular stuff like pork chops, bacon, and tenderloin, maybe ribs, you are missing out. I'm not saying you have to jump right into head cheese, but go try, say, spicy pig knuckles, maybe a black pudding with lots of mustard. Or, if you're feeling adventurous, maybe the Portuguese dish rosóis, which is a fatty fried pork with a heavily spiced pork blood gravy. Again, these are parts, tastes, and textures the modern American palate has lost contact with, but Americans have also recently chosen to accept yogurt, boba tea, and celery juice into our pantries. So why not look back as well? As I have mentioned, pigs were handy for turning scraps into edible food. Grain mash after making beer, scraps for making dinner, corn that had gone a bit off, and the windfall apples. And since those softening apples on the ground tended to get yeasty, it wasn't uncommon to find a tipsy pig. People, like pigs, enjoyed the fermented apple. Beer was the drink the colonists brought from England, but the really terrible grain harvests, crossed with the utter lack of hops, caused lots of these people to give up on beer for most of the 17th century, making cider the common North American tipple of the 1600s. So join me next week when I check to see whether the Pilgrims were getting drunk on cider. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast on your favorite widget like Good Pods or Podchaser really does make a difference, and it helps me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.